Ladies and gentlemen, now hosting the RizzoCast, put your hands together for Steven Risotto!
What is going on, everybody, and welcome. We are back with RizzoCast episode number 87. I'm Steven Risotto, and today we are joined by a very special guest. He is a writer at Primetime Sports Talk. He does other baseball writing. He's a big Red Sox guy. It is Jordan Leandre. How you doing, Jordan? What's going on? Welcome.
I'm doing well. I would love it if my Sox would make a little bit more splashes than Kristen Stewart today, but hey, another day above ground, can't complain.
Exactly.
Thanks for having me, by the way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on. And speaking of free agency, I mean, there's so much going on right now. It feels like 3 days of just like trade deadline, like the same atmosphere of the trading deadline, but like 3 days of it. It's insane. We know that there's a pending lockout that's sure to happen. But I mean, so many small markets, and I think this is really good for baseball. So many small markets are getting into the act. The Texas Rangers made some moves. Seattle's making some moves. The Mets, not that they're a small market, but they're a team that, a lot of people have been really down on the past few years. They're making some huge moves. So is there anything that has caught your eye? Any surprising deals? Any surprising teams? What have you noticed here with the lockout pending and some of these deals going down?
Well, first and foremost, I'm surprised that the fiasco of Steve Cohen's tweet after Matt signed with St. Louis didn't come back to bite him in the butt. Now, I know he spent, an absurd amount of money to get these players. And it's kind of funny because Yankees fans thought that this was the offseason they were going to have. They were going to land a stud starting pitcher. They were going to land a center fielder. They were going to land these depth guys that get on base, or, in the case of Escobar, hit a ton of home runs, driving runs. That hasn't happened for them. It's happened with the Mets. So the little brother is starting to kind of, punch their way through the ceiling a little bit, trying to catch up. The big thing that surprised me, though, was $500 million going to Corey Seeger and Marcus Simeon from the same team. I thought for sure when Simeon signed that Seeger was going to either be a Yankee or go back to LA somehow. That was the biggest surprise to me. It's going to be interesting to see how they configure that, because I know Simeon wanted to go back to shortstop. That was a huge, huge thing about him heading into free agency. And we all know Seeger isn't necessarily the best shortstop in the world, but you're paying him $32.5 million a year for the next 10 years. So you're going to have to kind of cater a little bit to what he wants. It'll be interesting to see how they make that work.
I would be stunned if Corey Seager got halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway through this 10-year, 11-year, whatever it is, the deal at shortstop. I mean, I think that the trend is, and I thought that he would be moved already to third base, but the Dodgers had a situation where Justin Turner was there and he was still, pretty good, pretty decent defensively. But Simeon is interesting. I did not have him going to Texas at all. As a matter of fact, I didn't have Seager going to Texas at all. I had Seager going to the Yankees, and I had Simeon going to maybe Seattle or San Francisco, or one of those teams, maybe the Yankees too, if Seager didn't work out there. But I thought Trevor Story would head to Texas. Everybody kept bringing up the point where, oh, he's a Texas guy, and that always seems to be the thing in free agency. But I do want to get into your guys here. 92-70 finish in the American League East last year. The Red Sox, they had a really nice postseason run. Was this a nice surprise after the, kind of the below 500 finish in 2020, or were there kind of some high expectations heading into 2021?
I felt like I was one of the eternal optimists of the Red Sox entering the season, and my ceiling for them was like 85, 86 wins. I thought realistically slightly above 500, but all I wanted out of them was September baseball that's meaningful. I didn't care necessarily if they made the playoffs, but after 2020, I wanted to stop being ashamed of watching them and devoting 3+ hours of my night to watching them. I didn't want to watch, the Zach Godleys and the Kyle Harts starting every night. Even though he struggled post crackdown, like getting to watch Garrett Richards, who used to be, a stud with the Angels, like getting to watch actual proven big league talent every night was awesome. So it was very refreshing, especially, getting into the playoffs, knocking off the Yankees and the Rays, which was, I mean, I just thought it was hysterical. Above all else. And then, it's crushing because they got so close, and I thought that they really kind of gave it away in the end. So it's almost typical Red Sox. Your expectations start low, they blow through them. You're all of a sudden like, they could win this whole thing, especially if they faced Atlanta. I thought they matched up pretty well against them, and then like a flick of a switch, they score like 4 runs in the last 3 games of the series. So, but overall, huge win.
Yeah, is Mike Kickham still in the Red Sox organization? Because I remember
he made Dodgers. I think
he made some appearances with the Red Sox, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. He did last year. I completely forgot about him. I think he ended up with the Dodgers at some point this season. Not 100% sure, but that was again, that's part of the past that I would like to get rid of. When he came over, I was like, the name sounds familiar. And I'm like, but how? And I looked, his last big league appearance was 2014. And I went, you know what? It might have been all my old MLB The Show runs with Road to the Show, seeing Mike Kickham in the minor leagues all the time. That's probably how I know him. And yeah, that did not work out well.
That's how we know a lot of players. Like that's a good point. Cause I mean, playing MLB The Show, even the younger fan that may not know a lot of the players in baseball, after playing MLB The Show, I feel like you would know like 50% more of the league. So I feel like, those kind of games, and I don't know if you play out of the park baseball, but I mean, that's another one where it's just insane. There's so many players. I mean, do you play OOTP? Because that's an unbelievable game.
I have it on my laptop. I wanted to do a simulation where, because I realized that there was a possibility that the Nationals could have ended up with both Trout and Harper in hindsight, and Strasburg. They could have ended up with all 3 of them. And I wanted to go back. I couldn't figure out how to make that work. I wanted to go back and simulate that and see how that would turn out, but I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And I got angry and I stopped playing because of that. But I wanted to get into it. I couldn't.
Yeah, no, it takes a while. I'll go on stretches where I play it a whole lot and I do different simulations, different years, different teams. And then I get frustrated because someone won't accept my trade. And then I just stop for a few months. But anyways, Boston, I mean, this offseason, what are you kind of looking for in terms of needs? Because I know every team has a need. Some teams only have to fill maybe a rotation spot, a bullpen spot. I mean, they've already signed Michael Wacha. There's a few other guys to minor league deals, as you mentioned before. So what is kind of the offseason outlook for Boston this time around?
Well, what I really wanted was for the Red Sox to go out and land one of these premier shortstops. Now, they still have a chance with Correa or Story if they want to. It's just with the way Bogaerts' contract shakes up and how he rates defensively, I think the best case scenario the best thing for the 2022 Red Sox is you sign a premier shortstop, and the worst case scenario is you have Bogaerts, Devers, and I'll use Correa as the example, for one season altogether for a run at a title. And then you lose Bogaerts in free agency, I imagine, because he'll opt out. Correa is a better player anyway. And you just end up with those 2 guys. And I think Devers' defense will improve by playing alongside Correa. I think Correa's offense will be great at Fenway. It's just, that's the guy that I identified. And I'd say maybe like August or so, when I realized how bad the Red Sox defense was. I'm like, I mean, Correa maybe if Bogaerts wants to move to second, but that's the guy I really wanted. After losing Erod, I would like to add a mid-rotation starter. There aren't really many of those guys left anymore. I loved the Wacha signing. I wasn't crazy about $7 million base salary, but I think that's a really good high upside signing. It's basically the same ballpark they gave Garrett Richards last year, except he signed a 1+1 and Wacha only got a 1-year deal. But I've liked the moves they've made. I just wish they would have done more to this point, considering all the the high priced sexy names that have gone off the board the last couple of days.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess I really think Andrew Heaney screwed up the market for the mid to back end rotation starters, because he got like $9.5 million and, kind of upset some things. I want to get back to Correa here because I really like Correa and I think he's right up there and he's going to get the shortstop, the deals that the shortstops have gotten the past few years with Lindor, the north of 300 million. And we always hear about how, he's a student of the game. He's really smart. He's sabermetrically minded. he's going to age well. You know, he's a bigger shortstop, but there's obviously no problem with that. He's been great at shortstop. Is Xander Bogaerts, because I mean, from an outsider looking in, I always thought Xander Bogaerts was kind of a mainstay at shortstop. I guess I didn't realize how bad of a defender he was. Now listening to your comments on it. So, you know, how does Carlos Correa kind of fit this Boston team? I know you just kind of went over it, but in deeper detail about Bogaerts, what is kind of, I don't know if I should say turned you off about him, because I think the bat still might be there, but why would you shift him the second and sign Correa?
I just think I looked at his defensive numbers because I've always thought before I got into analytics, I knew Bogarts wasn't like, the cream of the crop defensively. I thought he was roughly league average. I think he's at like negative 70 something defensive runs saved for his career at short. Like this past season, he had, I think he was at one point minus 11. He finished at -5. So he had a ridiculous second half defensively, which is weird because the Red Sox defense went south and his went north. But I think he can, similar to Simeon, if he moves to second base, it's a less physically demanding position to play defensively. I think playing alongside Correa will help alleviate a lot of the pressure on him to make all these plays defensively, and he can focus a little bit more on offense. Now his bat's great, but I think if he moved to second, could one, improve his value because his defense, I think, would improve at second base. And two, I think he could prolong his prime, like I said, because it's a less physically demanding position. And then as far as the Red Sox are concerned, I said earlier that Devers, I think his defense would improve playing alongside Correa because there's less of a burden on him to make up for, Bogarts' deficiencies, especially with his range. It just makes too much sense for it to not happen. But in the same breath, you have a former Rays executive, and I think it's going to take a few years for him to really be comfortable shelling out, $30+ million to one player. So that's why I think, like, if they're going to sign a shortstop, it would be Story at this point. But I'm holding out hope, man. I want Correa badly. I think that's a move that puts you in the World Series conversation.
Yeah, and a guy moving the second is so much more different than a guy moving the second like 10 years ago. Now you just the amount of athleticism you need to play second base has gone down. Like, I mean, we've seen Travis Shaw get moved there. Mike Moustakas had some reps at second base with Cincinnati, because all you just do is stand in shallow right field because you're in the shift. So, I mean, and you have to like be serviceable with the double play pivot. So, I mean, there's very few, skills needed to play some second base nowadays. And it's kind of interesting. I do want to bring up Story too, because Story is that other free agent shortstop that's available still at the time of this recording. Would he be, and I know Correa is your guy there, would he fit kind of the same mold? Would he, for the same reasons, or is Correa, or is, I'm getting all over the place here with these shortstops. Is Story kind of a different player with a different player profile in Boston?
I think he's a much lesser extent, but they could make it work the same way as they would with Correa. I think Story's offense would improve at Fenway Park again, kind of like I think with Correa. He's obviously not the same level player. Defensively, he's still elite though. And again, maybe he wouldn't help Devers as much because Correa is obviously better, but I think they could. It's almost, I wouldn't go poor man's version of Correa, but it's like an off-brand Correa in the sense that I think the impact he'd have on the team would be fairly similar, but obviously with Correa being a better player, just better offensively and defensively, obviously the impact Story would be less, but I think it would have a similar, trickle down effect where Bogarts would be better at second base. His offense would improve because he's not, taxing his body so much on defense. And then the same with Devers at third, and then whoever you want to put at first base.
Yeah, no, a league average season for Trevor Story last year offensively was not what he needed. And I guess the main thing is that he does some things that, Correa might not, like he steals bases and, later in the deal, if he's, grown out of shortstop, there's talk about some teams that were interested in him at the deadline that wanted to try him out in the outfield. So that was kind of interesting. So there's a few different pros and cons with Trevor Story. And you mentioned that maybe a mid-level arm for the Red Sox might be of interest. Would Marcus Strowman, because I know Marcus Strowman, I consider him like a 2.5, not quite 1, but more of a 2.5. Is he in their future, or would they not want to commit some money to Marcus Strowman?
I think I remember reading that they were interested in him at one point in the offseason. I think it was maybe within the last 10 days or so. The reason I personally am kind of turned off by Strowman is the Red Sox defense behind him. I compared him and Eduardo Rodriguez the last couple seasons. Obviously, neither of them played in 2020. So I went back to 2019. Their peripherals are virtually identical. Strowman's ERA is better because he's obviously played in front of a better defense in New York, and I think Toronto as well. Yeah, he got traded in 2019. So I think with the fact that Strowman relies more on his defense than Erod does, you'd see maybe not as drastic as like a 4.7 ERA to kind of deceive people into thinking he's been bad, but like a 4.4, 4.5, something in that range. It's just he depends so much more on the defense. I think a 5% difference in strikeout rate those last couple seasons, it's a significant drop considering how bad the Red Sox defense is. So if you sign Story and you want to go after Strowman after that, I'm game for that. But or Correa, but I don't think they'd want to make two gigantic commitments like that. But you need to make a statement on defense before you go and get a guy that relies on infield defense like Strowman does.
Yeah, I think that's a big reason why Steven Matz chose St. Louis. And his tweet that I just saw on my timeline before we came on here, that was like one of the first things he said was infield defense was a big reason why, and why he went to St. Louis. They won like 50 million gold gloves this offseason, so why not? Speaking of the Red Sox, and here's the fun stuff here. David Ortiz is going to be on the Hall of Fame ballot for the first time this season, making his debut for the writers to vote for him. And it is the most polarizing and controversial ballot to date. There's two guys that are coming on here, and A-Rod and Ortiz, that have some form of stereotypes. They're not comparable at all by any means, in terms of not just player profile, but the length and the way in which they used, and I put this in quotation, use steroids, because Ortiz's test was not supposed to be made public. It was a survey test, and A-Rod basically had a mafia around him. So what is kind of your take on David Ortiz? And we'll get into some of the other names in just a second, but what are his chances of getting in the ballot, getting into the Hall of Fame first year on the ballot?
I think they're pretty slim. I think a lot of writers nowadays, especially the last like 3-4 years, are really big on, looking for, I feel like they more so look for reasons to not vote for players rather than look for reasons to vote for guys. I'll get into more of that later when we talk more about the ballot at large. But like with David Ortiz, I saw an article that essentially said he didn't vote for Ortiz because of him getting shot in 2019 because of his connection with potential connection with drug dealers down in the Dominican Republic. It's like so you're punishing the dude for almost dying. Like if he wasn't shot, would you have voted for him instead? Like that can't be part of your logic. And then it's like I said, they're just looking for reasons to not vote for players now. I think it's again all about clicks now. We talk about these guys, we talk about these ballots. I would otherwise not know their names if they didn't make such ridiculous ballots like they tend to do.
Yeah, one of the guys that just put out a ballot, one of the most inconsistent. I mean, we've seen 5 ballots, and like one of them has been good that have been into the public tracker. Ryan Thibodeau does a really good job. But I mean, there's been so many weird decisions and weird philosophies with these ballots. And the one that I just saw was, I looked up who the writer was because I didn't recognize his name. And he's covering MLS soccer and has been for the last 10 years. And I'm thinking to myself, how does this guy have a ballot? Like it's really amazing to me that some of these guys have ballots. So are you pro steroid guys? I mean, I know some people are pro Bonds, Clemens, and others are kind of turned off by Manny Ramirez and the fact that he was suspended. I'll give you my thoughts in a second, but what do you think about those guys on the ballot as a whole?
I think the guys that, especially in the steroid era, shouldn't be punished for something that writers didn't care about back then, the league obviously didn't care about back then. Guys like Bonds and Sosa saved baseball by hitting the ball all over the ballpark, or hitting the ball all over the seats. They didn't hit it in the ballpark ever. I think with people like Manny and even A-Rod, and I'm trying to think of other guys on the ballot that have been suspended for PEDs, but I think those are the two big ones, A-Rod and Manny. Like, if you don't want to vote for those two, I get it. They were suspended. They knew the rules were that they can't take PEDs, and they still did it. I wouldn't use 03 against them, but like Manny got suspended in 09 and then again in 2011 before he retired. A-Rod had the whole biogenesis scandal as well. And I believe also 2009 with A-Rod. I could be wrong, but like those guys, I get not voting for them, but people like Bonds and Clemens, and to an extent like Gary Sheffield and Jeff Kent, and like Pudge Rodriguez back when he got inducted, like he's a guy that's a known steroid guy. So people like that, yeah, I don't think you can punish them. It's a completely different era. Like I said, yeah.
100% agree. And I have a few and I've said this on the show so many times. Hall of Fame is a museum, and like you can't just go from 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. Whoa, we're in 2010. Like, it doesn't work that way. Like, you can't just leave out a whole sector of the hall of the history of baseball. That's my number one argument. And also, it, as you mentioned, it was ignored for the longest time. Mark McGwire, during his 1998 home run chase, he had the bottle of Andro in his locker, and some guy from the Associated Press wrote about it, and they ridiculed him for writing about it. And it's just like, he ended up being right. And then, Canseco came out with the book and said that, this amount of people are using steroids, and here are the people that I have injected. Pudge was one of the names, and, Pudge is in the Hall of Fame. I don't understand how that's possible. I don't understand how Mike Piazza, who in his autobiography said that he was using Andro, and then when McGwire got caught, he stopped. And Bagwell, who might not have a direct link, still put up monster numbers and looked shredded during that era. So Bud Selig is in Cooperstown. I mean, the whole thing is broken. There's so many arguments against it. I want to get your take on this. Sammy Sosa is an interesting name on this ballot. Because my reason with Sosa, and I did not have him on mine, but I did have Bonds, Clemens, Sheffield. The reason I didn't put Sosa on there was because Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and, all those guys, they had careers before steroids. And like Sammy Sosa's career was more defined by steroids than the rest of them. Because what's his case? Power, like 600 home runs. That's the only thing. And he had crazy walk numbers too. But that was kind of the only thing going for him. And that's really steroid based. He really didn't have anything going for him before then. He was a skinny outfielder that, stole bases and, hit a little bit, and then steroids happened. So what is kind of your thoughts on Sammy Sosa? Let's hear.
Yeah, that's pretty much my take on Sosa. Is I'm looking at his Fangraphs page now, and spoiler alert, Bobby Abreu is on my ballot, but Sosa isn't. They put up pretty much comparable numbers in terms of wins above replacement, WRC plus. Abreu is actually higher up than Sosa is. Better OBP, similar slugging. Didn't have the home runs, but he pantsed them in doubles. So I think if you're talking about comparable guys, like Sosa was probably my number 11 or 12 on my ballot, because I'm a big Hall guy. Like you said, it's a baseball museum. These guys that had illustrious careers should be enshrined in it. I think Sosa was my 11th or 12th guy, depending on what I ultimately would have decided with regards to Schilling. But it's like I didn't think Sosa had a good enough career to kind of mask the fact that he did use steroids to boost his numbers,
Yeah, no, 100%. Do you want to reveal the rest of your ballot as in a whole?
Yeah. So I had, like I said, Bobby Abreu. I have Scott Rowland. I think the fact he's not in is a sham at this point. Barry Bonds, Clemens, Todd Helton, Andrew Jones, but that's mostly his defense. And, I think injuries really took away his prime. David Ortiz, mostly biased, but I think he's the best DH of all time. Manny Ramirez, A-Rod, and Billy Wagner. I think, again, Billy Wagner not being in to this point is a sham. He's one of the most dominant pitchers ever. And I know it's a big anti-reliever bias in voting, but like I have 31 pitchers with 300 plus saves. He's third in ERA behind Kimbrel and Rivera, fifth in FIP behind Chapman, Kimbrel, Jansen, and Tom Henke, fourth in strikeout rate, third in ERA plus, and among 451 primary relievers with 500 plus innings, he's third in ERA and ERA plus, fifth in FIP. Like the dude's dominant. He's got over 400 saves. The fact he's not in the Hall of Fame is ridiculous. That's him. He's probably the guy on here other than Roland that I'm like, really? Like, there's no argument against him at all. And you're keeping him out for what reason?
Yeah, no, he's on mine too. He was just so dominant. The strikeout numbers are through the roof. And a lot of the old school writers focus on like saves and, you know, the fact that Billy Wagner didn't have more than like 1,000 appearances or just over 1,000 appearances. It's really hard to compare, you know, it's really, really difficult. And we're going to get into this a little more in a sec, but it's really difficult to compare guys that had so many saves on good. Mariano Rivera had so many good goods. I cannot speak English right now, Jordan. Mariano Rivera had so many saves because he was on so many good teams, and not taking anything away from him. He's the greatest reliever of all time, but that's just a fact of it. Hoffman had so many saves because he pitched forever. Billy Wagner's career ended, you know, pretty much prematurely. He had the Achilles thing in 2010 in the postseason. He should definitely be in. I also have Gary Sheffield. I think the thing that works against Gary Sheffield is he was not a great defender. I think if he was a DH, he'd have a much better case, and he'd have a little bit more added on to his cumulative WAR and Fangraphs WAR and whatnot. And I also think the amount of teams he played on really kind of hurts his legacy. I know that sounds a little weird, but it's an argument for Fred McGriff that he had to deal with. And I think since you can't associate him with a certain team or a certain franchise, he gets hurt more than the guys like Chipper Jones and Derek Jeter and the guys, you know, they're not comparable, but my point is that some guys that last with one team are a bit more recognizable and carry a bigger legacy. I put Schilling in, you know, not necessarily a fan of what he says, and it's really not political. It's more of a human decency thing in my mind. But I still think he's in. Mike Mussina somehow got in over him. Even before the politics, Schilling wasn't really getting any traction. Scott Rowland is in for me too. Third base is way too underrepresented in Cooperstown. A-Rod, I think, should be in just because, you know, I can't leave him out for whatever reason. There's too much there. Manny Ramirez, I voted yes for Manny just because the second PED suspension ended his career, and I feel like he really wanted to play. He ended up going to Japan. He had some international experience, and that crushed him. And I think that's enough to where he served his penance. I mean, the second one ended his career, so that's my thoughts on that. Ortiz, slam dunk. I was really close on Andrew Jones and Todd Helton, but they would be my 10th and 11th, or my 11th and 12th. Andrew Jones, for the sole reason he did practically nothing in his 30s. I understand he came up at 19. I understand he's one of the greatest defensive center fielders, but just such a turn off his second half of his career. He doesn't have the, you know, anything in his 30s pretty much aside from one season. Jeff Kent is a guy that I have on there too. I feel like his numbers as a second baseman should not go unnoticed. I think his defensive metrics are a little bit overhyped. I don't think he was as bad as people think. And he has the most home runs in the history of second baseman. Clemens and Bonds, and Abreu would be probably my 13th guy. I do want to address, and I want to talk to you about this, about Omar Vasquel, because, you know, let's put, you know, some of the recent allegations aside for a second. I don't think he's a Hall of Famer. I think he's more of a compiler. Do you get that same feel?
Yeah, I think, and I wouldn't even necessarily call it Hall of Very Good either. Like, I think he just had a long, relatively productive career. Like, he got up to 42.5 FWAR, and he basically shouldn't have played from 2008 to 2012. He played 5 more years for just like no apparent reason. He only had 2 seasons where he was an above average hitter. Now I know I mean, you don't have the defensive metrics to back it up because he played so long before the DRS era, but he's probably one of the best, if not the best defensive shortstop ever. That's a big eye test kind of take, but 42.5 wins above replacement on Fangraphs. I believe it's 41.5 on Baseball Reference. And I know they don't play the same position, but like that's very comparable to Johnny Damon. And I don't think Johnny Damon's a Hall of Famer. He, like you said, he's a compiler. He played a long time. He played almost 3,000 games in his career, and he only accumulated 42 wins above replacement. Like,
25 seasons.
Yeah, he played from 89 to 2012. Like, he played before my older brother was born in 1990 to when my youngest sister was born in 2012. That is absurd. And he really didn't do anything. He had 1 6-win season in his career. It's just like, I think guys like Orlando Hudson had a better WAR 7 than he did. It's just, he's, like you said, he's a compiler. He is not a Hall of Famer.
And somebody did do the defensive analysis, and I understand that defensive metrics are far from perfect yet. But somebody did do a case study on this where they said Vasquel was really good at fielding the routine ground ball, and he wasn't as good as Ozzie Smith in terms of range. And I forget where, I don't know if I have that spot on, but it was something like that. I do want to ask about Todd Helton too, because Todd Helton for me is very close, and he had some really dominant years, but another guy who battled through injuries in the latter part of his career. And, you know, I do not use the Coors Field argument against him. It's not his fault he was drafted by the Rockies. I think, honestly, in my opinion, Coors Field does a lot of harm that nobody talks about. I mean, just waking up every day in that city, and, you know, there's negative effects to playing at Coors Field. It's not just positive. I'm sure he loved the positive. But I think it's time to stop with the Coors Field argument. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been fighting people about that with regarding Trevor's story all day. I think we overblow the Coors thing. Like, the ball moves completely different. Fastballs have more life, you know, in some places than others. And again, in Coors, like, curveballs move differently. It's tough to adjust to that constantly. And Helton was a machine on the road too. So, like, I think if anything, him being on the Rockies helps him a little bit, because he was so good at home, but he didn't have the Coors drop off on the road. He was unbelievable on the road as well. And I did some stat head stuff. There was only 7 players in league history with a 500 slug, 575 doubles, 2,500 hits, and 300 home runs, and Todd Helton's one of them. And I think, like, I know it's really specific. That's like an ESPN stat right there, but that's a lot of good numbers to have. And he's one of 7 players in MLB history to do that. And that in and of itself is Hall of Fame worthy. He had over 60 wins above replacement, narrowly missed 600 doubles. I'm a huge doubles guy. Like, that's why before I got into analytics, I love Miguel Andujar, but that's an argument for another day. 132 WRC plus. He had more hits than Frank Thomas, Jim Thome, Jeff Bagwell, Harmon Killebrew, and Willie McCovey. Like, he deserves to be in there, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's funny you brought up it's funny you brought up doubles, because, you know, there's something about extra base hits that turn a lot of people on now, and it does go to, you know, OPS and all that, and slugging percentage. But I want to mention Andujar real quick, because you brought it up. Somebody traded Miguel Andujar. Did you see this? Somebody traded Miguel Andujar on MLB Network in a package to get Matt Olson from the A's. I think it was Chris Young.
It was Chris Young.
And Andujar was DFA'd, and I think put on release waiver. So I was like, God, that's probably the worst. I mean, I digress. That was so off topic, but I had to bring it up because I couldn't get it out of my head ever since I saw it. But starting pitchers, it's so interesting, because starting pitchers, we're going to look at them a whole lot differently once they get on the ballot. And we're starting to see kind of the tail end of pitchers that pitched in this generation. Jake Peavy appeared on the ballot now for the first time. He's probably in Lincecum, I guess, kind of, not really. But it's going to be a lot harder for starting pitchers to get into the Hall of Fame, because the old school voters are still going to kind of be around, and they're going to notice the lack of innings. They're going to notice the lack of wins, which is a stat that nobody should be looking at. Um, that was the first, and I think a lot of people don't look at wins opposed to 15 years ago. Some still do. Hall of Fame voters, I think, still do. But it's going to be increasingly hard to get into the Hall of Fame. And I think Verlander still has those numbers. Scherzer, I think, is going to have those numbers. Kershaw, of course. But what would your criteria be in terms of this current generation? And I'm trying to think of, say, Jacob deGrom, for example. We look ahead to, a few years down the road, a lot of years down the road, I should say, and Jacob deGrom pops up on that ballot, or a guy who's, Shane Bieber. I'm topping off names in today's game. How would we even evaluate these guys? I feel like it's such an interesting conversation to have.
This is where I think you almost have to be praying that by the time they're on the ballot, you have a lot more sabermetric minded individuals voting, because like you said, the wins people are going to absolutely kill it. Like I already am mentally preparing for Jacob deGrom to not be a unanimous Hall of Famer or like a second or third ballot guy. And that's just ridiculous. He's having one of the best peaks in MLB history, or at least in the last, 50, 60 years. Like people are like, there are stats that compare him to Pedro during his run from 98 to 2001, where he was, one of the best pitchers ever. It's really tough to figure out like what the criteria needs to be. Like I said, I think you need to be analytically minded, or at least open-minded to looking at analytics when it comes to these guys, because Jacob deGrom had what, a 1.7 ERA in 2019 and was under 500 for his record, was like 12-13, maybe it was 13-12. Like, how are you going to hold that against him? And then I think he went 7-9 one year and had an ERA like a notch above 2. Like, how can you punish him for that? Like, do you want him to go out there and throw a perfect game every single night? That's like, if his offense isn't doing their part, that's not the fault of the pitcher. His job is to go out and dominate, and he does it.
Yeah, no, and I 100%. And I never in my entire life never looked at wins. I always thought it was such a bogus stat. A guy could throw 8 scoreless innings and, give up an error, or not give up an error, but somebody could commit an error and he would, get the loss, or he could pitch 9 great innings and give up a bloop single and a walk could score, or something like that. And, it's really not fair. And I think also it goes for relievers too. A guy could come in for one batter and then they could score when he's technically on the mound in the half inning. And like, that's stupid. Like, I think the win should be given to, I don't know if it should be given at all, but I think it should be given to the starting pitcher that dominated that day, opposed to reliever who came in for a batter. So it's broken, and I can't believe people still look at it. Now that leads me into this final Hall of Fame point here. I talked about the amount of ballots that we've seen, but for you, what would you say warrants a ballot, getting removed, or somebody getting their vote taken away? And I'll tell you mine after, but I always see people on Twitter say, this guy should have his ballot revoked because he did so-and-so, or voted for so-and-so, or did this. What would be your criteria for taking a vote away from someone?
If you submit an empty ballot, like seriously, maybe not completely revoked to the point where you like can't get it back the next year, but if your ballot is submitted and it's empty, it shouldn't count. Like, are you kidding? Like, I know that I'm a little bit lenient with a lot of guys. I think when the ballot came out, I said there were as many as like 15 or 16 players you can make a case for on this ballot being a Hall of Famer. I understand there's some people that are really strict and are like, no, there's 7 or there's 5. And it's like, but for some reason, I can't remember his name. It's escaping me right now. But the guy who submitted the empty ballot that said, he anti-PEDs, and then he thinks he's doing a favor for Curt Schilling by not voting for him. It's like, I don't think that's what Schilling really wanted, but anyway. And then said he was close on rolling, but decided he wasn't elite, or he didn't stack up well against elite third baseman. And I'm like, he's like a top 10 third baseman ever. Where like, how is he like, what is elite? Is that top 3 or 4?
And there's
He's
like
not
no
top
third
3 or 4.
baseman in the hall.
Yeah, it's like he's a top 10 third baseman of all time. He's one of the best defensive players ever. He was a great offensive guy. I know injuries kind of killed him in his prime, but he had a great career. He's like I said, one of the best defensive players ever. But if you submit an empty ballot, like it either shouldn't count, or you should lose your right to vote in this. And like, I shouldn't say right, your privilege to vote in Hall of Fame balloting. Because imagine being so great at your job, and then some random dude that watches maybe 5 or 6 baseball games a year is like, Scott Rowland, like, that name just doesn't, really ring a bell. So I'm not going to vote for him. And then you have dudes voting for like Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard because he covers the paper in the Philly area. It's like, really? Empty ballots, though. That you submit an empty ballot, I seethe. I get ticked.
Yeah, no, I'm down on empty ballots too. I would also say, if you really think there's no Hall of Famers, don't submit one. Like, don't, because it's going to take like 3 or 4 votes for, the guys that he didn't vote for to recover from that. And, it's really, 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 really bad to submit a empty ballot. I have another one for you too. I would say outliers. So if you're one guy that votes for LaTroy Hawkins on a Hall of Fame ballot, and
is that Bob Nightingale?
I think you're completely right. It was Bob Nightingale, which is the most ironic thing ever, because it's not surprising anymore now. I think it was Bob Nightingale. But if you're one person that votes for a player and the other hundreds of guys don't, and the other hundreds of writers, I should say, don't, then you're obviously wrong, and you should have your Hall of Fame vote revoked. And it goes for the other way too. If you're one guy that didn't vote for Derek Jeter and 99%, more than 99% of people did vote for Jeter, you're wrong. Like, it's just factual information that he's a Hall of Famer based on what the other people said, and one person doesn't vote for him. Like, that's insane. And I know it was more than one, person that didn't vote for him, but I'm making a point. But I just say the outliers. I would say the outliers probably would lose a vote, in my opinion. I don't know how it would work. I don't know how that process would, how that phone conversation would go. Like, hey, I just got your blank ballot. You don't have a vote next year. Like, just imagine that conversation with like James Forbes Clark, or whoever in the Hall of Fame is in charge of that, the BBWA, whatever. That would be insane. So
yeah, I think at least if you're going to submit an empty ballot, I need you to write an article of some sort explaining your thought process on a lot of these guys. So like, if you're anti-PEDs, I don't blame you for not voting for any PED guys. I'm not going to ridicule you for that. My preference is put them in. If you don't think so, you don't think so. But for somebody like Scott Rowland, I need you to show me your research and tell me why he doesn't stack up against elite third baseman. I need you to show me Jeff Kent and show me why he doesn't stack up against elite second baseman. Show me somebody like Andy Pettitte, who I think is also a bubble case, why he doesn't deserve to get inducted into the Hall of Fame. Andrew Jones, same type deal. Bobby Abreu, even. Like, there are a lot of guys that are worthy of consideration. You need to tell me why you didn't vote for them for me to think you actually take your job seriously or your responsibility seriously. This is too powerful of a position in the baseball world for you to just be like the guy who voted for Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard was like, all right, get me a pen. Yep, of course I'm voting for Rollins and Ryan Howard. I'm like, 14 reference war Ryan Howard, who stunk after 2012. Like, really? I think you need to, at least, if you're going to submit an empty ballot, you better be prepared to back that up.
And Mark Teixeira would like a word with that guy too. Because there's I mean, that's crazy. But I mean, yeah, it's a matter of opinion. And I think the reason that everybody's been saying, wow, that's a bad ballot, is because they have been bad ballots because they're inconsistent. And that's all we ask as fans of baseball, is for the writers to be inconsistent, or to be consistent, and not have any inconsistent analysis when they're doing this, because it is a big deal, as you mentioned. Like, if you want to not vote in steroid users, I understand why people would be ticked off that people cheated the games and cheated the record books. I get it, but there's also a whole different side that they have to be exposed to, I think. So we're going to wrap up here. and you're not going to avoid this, but the first pitch that you threw in Boston, I see it
man.
so often. You don't even do you even have an idea on how often MLB Network shows that clip?
I don't get to watch MLB Network much because I don't have my cable package out here in Arizona. So I don't get to watch MLB Network that often, but whenever it pops up on social media, I get tagged a few times. So I see it from now and then. And I actually, somebody in one of my classes, we had to do like a profile story, and he was like, "I want to interview you about your first pitch." I'm like, "Of course you do." I can't escape it.
Do you want to give some background on what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the whole thing is I'm throwing out the first pitch with the 1967 Impossible Dream Team behind me. Mike Andrews is he's catching for me, tells me don't throw it too hard, don't throw it too soft, don't throw it too high, don't throw it too low. Don't try and like rip his glove apart. Don't make him have to reach for it too far.
Older guy.
Yeah, older guy. He was, I think he was definitely had to be in his 60s or maybe early 70s by that point. And I'm in the middle of my windup, and I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to let it go. And it was too late in my windup to make that kind of commitment. And it just sailed on me. That thing took off. And I always talk about how my back like cracked in like 6 different places when I threw that. I was so tight when I went up there. It was insane. And like I said, made that commitment way too late. And, unfortunately, Mr. Tony Capobianco had to pay the price on the receiving end of that.
Yeah, I'll say it. It hit the cameraman in the balls. So
yeah,
he's still feeling it a few years later, but that's one of the all-time clips. And I'm glad it doesn't seem like a sore subject at all. I'm sure you like when people bring it up.
Yeah, I mean, I played it off pretty well. I knew when it happened. I think I tweeted "yikes" with like an ellipses after it when it happened, and then I tweeted again in that game because that was an Erod start and he struggled. And I said, Erod's not looking too pretty out there. Do they need me to go warm up? I was just getting started, and stuff like that. And I even messaged Jackie Bradley Jr. on Snapchat because he used to have a public Snapchat. I don't know if he still does, but he did at the time. And I said, thank you for having a more accurate arm than I did, because he like cut down a runner at the plate. And he said, you just need a redemption shot. So he was a pretty good sport about it. I got to go on, Section 10, got to do a bunch of different interviews. It was a cool, like 15 minutes of fame for all the wrong reasons, a nice icebreaker, because I didn't make a lot of friends my junior year of high school at a new school. So, it was a good icebreaker my senior year. There are definitely pros and cons to this situation.
Yeah, and I guess if you have there's so many of us, and I lack this too. There's so many of us that like wish they had a fun fact when there's ice, because when I got to college, they always do the one interesting thing about yourself. You have one, and like that's so perfect, and like it's such a perfect story to tell. So I can't wait for the future kids to hear about that one and know that their dad's a legend for doing what he did there. So real quick before we sign off here, I know you're writing Primetime Sports Talk. Anderson Picard was on this show. Love Anderson. He's going to, take the media world by storm soon. But what is kind of your career aspirations? What is the end goal with baseball media?
I definitely would like to write and continue writing beyond college. I think that's once I hurt myself in high school, I knew that I had no shot at playing baseball beyond, maybe a D3 school, but I always wanted to be in the game. So I like writing. I think the ultimate end goal is I want to do radio talk show, like sports talk show. I love talking about sports. I think I articulate way better when I'm speaking versus when I'm writing. I'm also a lot quicker to, respond and like I said, articulate my argument. But that's probably the end goal, is sports talk radio. But obviously I would like to keep writing on the side because I do have a passion for it as well.
A lot of fun. Appreciate it. Jordan, thanks for coming on. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, you guys can follow Jordan on Twitter at Jordan, JORDAN LEANDRE55. Go follow him on Twitter. Keep up with all your Major League Baseball analysis, content, Red Sox, all over the place. And you guys can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at RizzoCast. New episodes coming soon. And thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe, Apple, Spotify, you know the drill. And see you next time.